continue by firms in the IIM are organized, and more specifically, I'll focus on their management practices. So just to start off, I'll give you some motivation for why it's important to look at this topic. So it is a stylized fact in the field of development economics that there is a large productivity gap between firms in emerging and advanced economies. And the evidence that we have to date suggests that most of this gap is due to a lower production efficiency of firms in emerging economies. So a natural question that arises is, what explains the production efficiency of these firms? And here, one line of research, one line of argumentation points to the role of good management practices. There is a research gap, though, in the sense that most of the evidence that we have is on larger firms and advanced economies, and we have relatively little evidence on smaller firms and emerging economies. But the evidence here also suggests that for these smaller firms, management may be very important for their firm performance. So if we think about the policy relevance of this topic, it becomes clear that in view of this evidence, it's highly relevant to investigate the level of management quality among the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the Mozambican manufacturing sector, since management may be important not only for these firms' performance, but also for driving manufacturing growth in the country overall. So with this chapter, we really had two main objectives, which were to, first of all, provide a general overview of the level of management quality across these firms and across different firm and manager characteristics, such as the firm size and the sector of the firm. And our second objective was to look at whether we can really find this positive relationship between management quality and firm performance. So in terms of our methods, we made use of a business practices index, which consisted of 20 questions, 20 survey questions that we asked in both 2017 and 2022. And they relate to 4 management categories, so namely marketing, buying and stock control, cost and record keeping, and financial planning. And these practices are really supposed to reflect key business practices used in the day-to-day running of these smaller firms. And they should be seen as best practices that all firms would really benefit from adopting. And it's also important to understand that these practices are supposed to be relatively easy to learn and do not depend so much on entrepreneurial ability. So here you can see some examples. So the practices included, for example, whether the firms visited their competitors to see their prices and products. So that would be a marketing practice. And it also included, for example, whether the firms regularly review their financial performance and have sales targets. So that would be a financial planning practice. But here in this table, you can actually see a list of all the 20 business practices that we asked the firms about and the share of firms that use these individual business practices. But I've marked here in orange the most used business practices by these firms in both 2017 and 2022. And they were buying and stock control practices. So more specifically, whether the firms negotiated with their suppliers for lower prices and whether the firms compare alternative suppliers. But at the bottom of the table, you can also see marked in blue the least used practices in both years. And they were whether the firms have an annual profit and loss statement and whether the firms have an annual income or expenditure sheet. But here you can see actually that this result was driven by the micro firms who make up the largest share of our sample and who use relatively less financial planning practices. So you can see on the right-hand side that in 2022, for example, the microfirm, only 14% of microfirms had an annual profit and loss statement compared to around 84% of small firms and 93% of medium-sized firms. So there's a large difference across firm size. But moving to some of our descriptive results, first of all, you can see here in the graph on the left that only very few firms, so only around 1% of the firms in both years did not use any of the 20 business practices that we asked about. But at the same time, you can also see that only relatively few, so only around 4% in 2017 and around 2% in 2022 used all of the 20 business practices. Overall, the firms used on average 55%, so that's around 11 out of 20. And just to put that into perspective, other research has found that in Ghana, for example, firms used 44%, in Kenya 52%, and in Nigeria 76% of business practices, using the same business practices index that we also used. So that really shows that the Mozambican manufacturing firms are kind of in the upper middle field in terms of their management quality compared to these other countries. But the figure also shows that there is no clear trend over time, in the sense that there's no large, or that we did not find a large increase or decrease in the use of business practices over the time period that we looked at. But we actually also saw that this average overall results really masks some heterogeneity across firm size and across the different management categories. So we found that the use of business practices clearly increases with firm size. So the micro firms used less than 10 out of the 20 business practices in both 2017 and 2022, compared to the small and medium-sized firms, which used around 15 in both years. And we also found actually that the micro firms managed to slightly increase their use of business practices over this time period, whereas the small and medium-sized firms actually saw a drop in 2022 compared to 2017. And lastly, we also saw that the relative importance of these different management categories that I mentioned varies with firm size. So we found that for micro firms, marketing and buying and stock control practices are relatively more important, whereas for those larger firms, so the small and medium-sized firms, cost and record keeping and financial planning practices are relatively more important, which I also already pointed out on the previous slide. So just briefly moving to some more descriptive results, we also looked at some other firm and owner characteristics. And we found that in both years, the best performing firms, in the sense that they use the most business practices, belonged to the paper and chemical sector and were located in Maputo city province. And this actually makes a lot of sense, since the most complex firms and many larger firms belong to these sectors and are located in Maputo city and, more generally speaking, in the south of Mozambique. Then we also looked at the gender of the owner or manager of the firm, but here we did not find a clear effect on the use of business practices or on the management quality of these firms. However, we did find that formal firms, so those that have a tax identification number, use a lot more business practices than informal firms. So on average, they actually used around 4 more business practices in both 2017 and 2022 than the informal firms. But lastly, moving to the second objective of our chapter, which was to see whether we can also find this positive relationship between firm performance and management quality. We did indeed find that the use of more business practices is associated with a better firm performance as measured by firm value added. So in the second step, we actually disaggregated this result and looked at the different management categories again. And here we found that only financial planning practices actually significantly and positively affect firm performance. So we found that the use of an additional financial planning practice was on average associated with a 14% increase in firm performance. So that's also an economically meaningful result. But we did not find an effect for marketing, buying and stock control, and cost of record keeping practices. So just to briefly conclude, we found that there is significant room for improvements in the adoption of these business practices across these firms, and in particular for the micro firms who used less than 10 out of the 20 business practices in both years. Then we found that financial planning practices in particular seem to be very important for firm performance. So if we think about the policy implications of this result, one could argue that a targeted training could really go a long way in improving the adoption of these business practices for these firms, but also in improving the firm performance of the micro, small, and medium enterprises in the Mozambican manufacturing sector, and thereby potentially even drive overall manufacturing growth in the country. Obrigado.
Então, as